Okay, good evening and good morning as well. I'd like to begin proceedings by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this unceded land on which I am presenting, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and those emerging, and to all Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders witnessing this presentation. I'm Professor Donald Bates. I'm the Chair of Architectural Design at the Melbourne School of Design here at the University of Melbourne. As well, I act as the Associate Dean Engagement. It is my great pleasure to be able to welcome you to this event, the AA Global Forum coming from Melbourne. This is the first of a series of Global Forum through the Architectural Association, and we're very pleased to be able to launch this series all the way from Melbourne. In order to get it started, I want to turn over the microphone to Manijeh Verghese, who's the head of public program and engagement also at the Architectural Association. So I turn it over to you, Manijeh, and welcome.
Thank you, Don, and hi everyone. It's great to be here, albeit virtually, and thank you so much for joining the first AA Global Forum event. And as Don mentioned, it's organized as a collaboration between the Architectural Association and the Melbourne School of Design. And we're really grateful to the Melbourne School of Design for hosting this exciting inaugural event. So for those of you who don't know me, as Don mentioned, I'm Manijeh Verghese, and I run the public programs at the AA. And to tell you a bit about the Global Forums, they're an initiative developed as a hybrid between our public programs and our visiting school program as a way to connect our global network of alumni, members, visiting school participants, tutors, partners, prospective students, and friends as a space to learn, share, and discuss architectural ideas and initiatives in both a local context, and whether that's online and through on-site meetings or lectures or workshops. And it's fitting that this first event is hosted by the University of Melbourne and the Melbourne School of Design, with whom the AA has enjoyed such a long-standing relationship, both through the visiting school program, as well as through several of the School of Design faculty members, many of whom are AA alumni or who have taught across both institutions and will be speaking as part of today's event. So these global forums are by nature collaborative and help us feel more connected at a time when we're geographically separated. And therefore, looking at how we teach, research, and communicate architecture today is a terrific focus for the conversations we're about to have. Following this inaugural Global Forum, upcoming events will be held in the Caribbean, Berlin, and in South Korea, just to name a few. And we hope that these events will be an exciting way to connect our audiences around the world. And we'd like to invite everyone to join us for other events in the public program, or to come spend some time at the AA when that's possible again, or be part of any of our international programs through the visiting school. So I'm really looking forward to an exciting series of discussions over the next few hours. And I also wanted to mention that there's an opportunity for all participants to join a spatial chat during the coffee breaks throughout the session. And this will be via a link that was sent to you in advance as a way to connect with fellow Global Forum participants in a digital space. So without any further ado, I'll hand back over to Don to get the session started.
First of all, thank you to Manijeh for the introduction, but also to welcome both the AA in London, but all of the AA participants around the world. We have a whole body of people here in Melbourne that have taught at the AA, who have studied at the AA, have various connections and research projects with the AA. And we're very pleased to be able to host this session and be part of this larger community as a whole. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Paul Lowe, who's really been the person responsible for organizing the event here in Melbourne, and is also responsible, along with Mond Qu, with running the AA visiting school that we also host in Melbourne. So to Paul and to Leire.
Thank you, Donald. Thank you, Manijeh, for the welcoming words. I'm going to share the slides for presentations. Just bear with us a second. So thank you, Donald. Thank you, Manijeh, for the kind remarks. And friends, colleagues, and AA alumni globally, thank you for joining us for this very exciting evening. We have 3 roundtable sessions I'm going to be chairing the first one, titled Pedagogy as Design Research. And I have invited Theo Lalis from LASA as our speakers and Leire Asensio as also our speakers. Now, before I introduce them, my name is Paul Lowe. I also like to acknowledge the traditional owner of the land on which this event took place, the land of the Wurundjeri. I pay respect to my elders, past, present, and future. I'd like to give us very short remarks, a kind of pretext to our discussions before I introduce the speakers in more detail. And I'll ask each of our speakers to present for 15 minutes, and then we will hopefully have a 20 minutes discussions with some Q&A from the audience. So audience that's joining us online, if you'd like to have any questions, please put your questions on the Q&A functions on the Zoom, should be somewhere in the bottom. And those audience with us in physical formats, there will be a roaming mic coming around you. I might have to do some translations because of audio difficulties. So architecture design educations is always unique and it's unique in the way that it's been taught in the last really kind of centuries. So we're always been taught and clustered around these ideas of a studio or atelier, and I guess the AA famously kind of pioneered the unit system on which many of us who are alumni has been through the system. And obviously during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, this system has almost took on the laboratory ethos. The design research lab at the AA almost epitomized this heightened sense of laboratory, sense of exploration in design research. And increasingly in the last 2 decades, we started to observe an emerging way of teaching in architecture design educations where physical prototypings, fabrications, and making started to bring in a sense of practice onto architecture educations. And I think today, and this evening, these sessions, we're going to really focus on this topic of how do we fold research into architecture educations, into practice, into design practice, and then back again into architecture educations. And I have to line up 2 amazing speakers, Theo Lalis from LASA, as I mentioned, and Leire Asensio, who will be joining us, will be presenting first. Now, I'm just going to read a little bit of bios of Leire. I'm not going to go really quite into detail, but because I think Leire is going to speak for itself. And following that, I'm going to then ask Theo to present again 15 minutes. I'll introduce Theo later. So Leire Asensio is our senior lecturer here at the Melbourne School of Design in Urban Design and Architecture. She has previously taught at the Harvard GSD, Cornell University, and at the AA in the Landscape Urbanism program. Leire has been collaborating with David Ma as Asensio Ma since 2002, and she has authored and co-edited several books. Tonight, she will share her teaching and research journey through the AA, from the AA all the way to Melbourne School of Design. So I'd like to welcome Leire Asensio to give our presentations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you for the invitation to participate here this evening. So again, thank you very much. My position in relationship to the notion of architectural pedagogy as research has been informed by my own experiences. Within this short 15-minute presentation, I thought I will offer a snapshot of my own global journey from the AA to Melbourne, as Paul said, and how that journey has helped me define my investment in the design studio as a site for research. As someone who has had the opportunity to operate in the professional and academic fields, I have found that the benefits of a conversation or a feedback relationships between teaching, research, and practice has been valuable to all my spheres of engagement. For me, this has meant an engagement across a range of disciplines and geographies, which has seen me explore, teach, and practice in the UK, Europe, North America, and now Australia. It has also seen me embedded within architectural, landscape, and urban design departments at different institutions, including Harvard, Cornell, and now here at the University of Melbourne. But I will begin the presentation by admitting my own personal relationship or connection to the AA. I joined the AA as a diploma student in 1998, and I also went back to teach in the graduate school for a number of years since 2004. In my 4th year, I studied with Farshid Musavi and Alejandro Zaira Polo in Deep 5, and I completed my honors thesis with Theo Nagle and Hanif Kara in Deep 14. And as I said, I went back to teach in the Landscape Urbanism studio till around 2007. I can probably begin a discussion about architectural pedagogy as research by reflecting on my honors thesis at the AA. So I believe that the luxury of the one-year unit system at the AA, particularly within the context of the diploma school, was a great format for pedagogy as a vehicle for the production of design research. From my experience, it enabled the production of an intense design culture and shared focus of the units, while also giving its students the framework for a relatively prolonged and immersed design exploration. Reflecting back now, it is clear that the interdisciplinary research, teaching, and practice trajectories that I have pursued has strong seeds in my years at the AA. So owing to opportunities presented by a full year of exploration, coupled with the emphasis established by the units that I joined at the AA, my thesis afforded the capacity to engage with multiple scales and scopes of engagement. So engaging with the massive seasonal urbanization fluctuations in Spain's touristic East Coast, I immersed in the study of wider urbanization patterns, ecological systems, and extremely fluid populations. My studies allowed me the opportunity to engage with a close study of forms of urbanization through a lens that was particularly sensitive to its temporal and environmental dimensions. Working across a range of scales, the project also afforded me a deep dive into the material explorations. I was able to undertake a sustained development of novel buoyant aggregative folded structures. And this material research was also enabled by Hanif opening his office basically to support the unit. The project also benefited from a dialogue with very hands-on material explorations. So the multi-scalar emphasis of the units at the time gave me the space to engage deeply in the spectrum spanning between urbanism and tangible material research. And I also need to emphasize that all of this was done approximately about a decade prior to the user-friendliness and accessibility of now conventional tools such as Grasshopper. So my project was also very much informed by a landscape sensibility. The design response to a wide multi-scalar exploration operated at landscape scale and temporality. And in my own experiences as a student at the AA, I was exposed to the relatively unbridled possibilities of the unit, or perhaps the design studio as a fertile site for research. That experience and the specific themes of my project has been instrumental in supporting my own pedagogical approach, where I have sought to support students at the AA, Cornell, Harvard, and now here at the MSD to undertake their own multi-scalar explorations. So this early experience at the AA also has been an inspiration for my own interdisciplinary engagement in both research and teaching. A lot of this has been done in collaboration with David Ma, another ex-AA fellow and another ex-AA and a fellow traveler. So over the last 20 years since the AA, I have orchestrated conversations across research, teaching, and practice with varying emphasis ranging between urbanism through to material or constructive systems. One of the moments where the feedback between my different fields of engagement became most apparent was in a series of ongoing chains of cross-fertilization between teaching, practice, and research. It made it clear for me that these areas traditionally seen as separate were in fact most vital when all aim at the production of new knowledge, or in other words, it is all research. While teaching at the AA in the Landscape Urbanism Studio, the emphasis was on the shaping and occupation of the ground, and through my teaching, and this began slipping into my own practice. This ignited another research and teaching focus, which splintered off from this slippage between my life as an educator, researcher, and as a practicing designer. So the built house offered an alternative to the conventions of suburban development in this region of Spain. Instead of the wholesale flattening of parcels by shaping the ground, in line with its existing topography, an alternative model for suburban house was offered. A model more explicitly in dialogue with its gardens, greatly reducing its footprint and opening up the site to permeable ground rather than the spreading of a bloated villa all over its extent. This interest in transforming existing developmental conditions to offer alternative models of the constituents of urbanization moved into my teaching as well. So a number of studios at Cornell were structured to allow for a shared exploration of these themes. And this extended exploration, primarily sustained through teaching and practice, will then find a sustained research focus in the Health and Places Initiative at Harvard, conducted through a dedicated design research project and a parallel interdisciplinary design studio. With David, I co-led the research into how existing superblock residential developments in China could be structured to better address public health concerns. And was also interdisciplinary in focus with researchers and students from architecture, urban design, landscape, as well as in collaboration with the Harvard School of Public Health. So we can see some of the outcomes of the dedicated research project here and the design studio. And for me, this chain was this chain was a revelation of the many concrete ways in which research may be propelled within the framework of teaching. But more importantly, it illustrated the vital relationships between teaching, research, and the creative practice in propelling a larger research exploration. Moving between a Spanish House Commission through studios on North American Sunbelt development to research on the Chinese Xiaochu, some of my current research centers on Melbourne's urbanization. Some of this is done as dedicated research, as well as through the development of courses within the urban design and architecture streams here at the MSD. So looking at the ongoing transformation of the city's inner ring suburbs, and offering alternative modes of densification, which aim to balance with the other pressures of the environment. And this is explored through creative practice research. This extensive research into Melbourne's urbanization is also explored through the design studios under the larger research initiative umbrella of the ARC-DR3, led by UCLA, Tohoku University, and the Mirai Khan Museum. I have been leading a series of design studios here in Melbourne with David. And these studios explore the reconsideration of larger urban systems and practices in light of water-based shocks and disruptions anticipated with climate change. This has involved the reconsideration of food and energy cycles and new forms of urban infrastructures, a reconsideration of agricultural practices and more diversified and ecological land use patterns that support the city. And also explore the reconfiguration and ecological reclamation of the public realm of crown land of the city's interface with water. This larger investigation into the design world's capacities to engage with environmental concern has also been pursued by us in a new role, that of curators, where we have recently curated an exhibition on the climate imaginary for the Melbourne Design Week, and the exhibition operating as a survey of the current landscape of design engagement with climate emergency by the wider global design community. Another line of teaching and research, which has some origins in my days as a student at the AA, relates to material and tectonic exploration. However, I will insist that these explorations share the same mandates and ambitions as the larger urban studies, but focusing on another area of creative practice. So for several years, I directed a number of electives at Harvard, focused on developing constructive prototypes, working with modern systems or ceramics. These courses were a forum for design research. Many of the projects developed in the course will be subsequently published in major academic conferences and journals, or will be the foundation for doctorate research. This research theme is also extended through my own creative practice, research projects, and mostly with David, developing a range of prototypes, exploring the capacities of contemporary ceramics, new forms of masonry, and synthetic substrates, intersecting with garden and landscape traditions. Emerging from this work is a research project very much tied to these courses. This work, which is anticipated to be published in the coming year, showcases the formal study of a legacy modern exemplar in the work of Erwin Hauer. The project involved a long-standing exploration of the underlying construction of Hauer's pieces and artifacts. The project begins with a more conventional design archaeological research. But following the premise of the course of upgrading modern systems, looking at how this analytical phase can operate as tools for future creative practice, allowing us to generate a massive sample of possible continuas from this deep dive into material design history. We were interested with this precedent because of its unique status as an alternative reading of the building envelope as a filter and veil rather than the dematerialization through glass prevalent in modern architecture. With the original and new instantiations, there is then the possibility to offer performances and applications which could then be taken forward collectively by the discipline rather than simply leave it as an exemplary relic of history. So in conclusion, having undertaken a 2-decade-long movement between the AA and Melbourne, I have found myself enabled to explore this wide range of scales of an interdisciplinary research. Coming into focus has been what was an initially tacit but now explicit mandate of exploring design practices, which go some way to building a design culture aimed at addressing environmental concerns. Throughout this trajectory, I have found that this larger research agenda has been consistently accelerated by explorations in a wider range of forums and formats, including through pedagogy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leire. Thank you, Leire, for this presentations. If you have any burning questions for Leire, would you just mind holding on the physical audience? Audience is online, you can put it on the Q&A functions. I will come around and moderate it in a second. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Theo Lalis. Hello, Theo. So Theo is the co-founder of LASA Architects, together with Dora Swatch, with office in London and Brussels. So he's currently joining us from Brussels. So Theo has previously taught at Harvard, Columbia, Chalmers, LTU in Sweden. He's also the unit master of Diploma 17 AA since 2009. His practice has always had a very strong interest in the politics of constructions, both within his practice and also teaching, started to question the role of technology in the democratization of the non-standard production of architecture. So we look forward to hear some of Theo's very recent project as well. He already showed me the slides. I've got some sneak preview. So Theo, over to you.
Hello, thanks a lot, Paul and John, for the invitation. It's a great honor to be back in Melbourne, actually, although still in Brussels. I will be sharing my slide. Hello, everyone. My name is Theo Lalis, and I've been teaching at the AA together with Dora Swade since 2009. We teach a unit called Diploma 17. One important thing to mention about the AAs is that I think that the AA's greatest strength is that it's an incubator of practices. So it's very, what we do at the AA is very indistinguishable from practice. And the previous presentation is also another example of, DIP 5 spinning off into FOA, but there's countless examples of tutors and students collectively working on developing new culture that then becomes the framework for practicing in the real world. So parallel to the unit, we run a practice called LASA. Our work with the unit and the practice has developed along two main lines of inquiry. First, the design of architectural form for its capacity to engage the body. And secondly, the politics of construction and the role of the architect. I would like to start by discussing a number of observations and positions that overlap or that are shared between the practice and the work of the unit at the AA. First, the standardization produced by building codes and the mass production of architectural elements has resulted in the homogenization of built form. We see architectural trends nowadays of leaning towards austerity and the kind of the generic. Another problem is the transnational supply chain where architectural elements are shipped around the globe with us not knowing who made them, where and under which conditions, so labor conditions, environmental problems related to the architectural products we use. And so in a world perfectly sealed products, that are designed for planned obsolescence, we think it's particularly meaningful to know and engage with how things are made. So currently, design automation with BIM and the integration of product libraries in our drawing tools is reducing the architect's role to production management and product specifications. But I think in general, we are quite interested in the digital, but we're also quite critical of it. We think a certain type of automation is generating a certain amount of passivity. And so that in the real world and in an academic context is extremely frightening. And so, you know, a big part of re-engaging with the means of production is also bringing creativity at the forefront. I think the frictionless character of all the tools we use is generating a lack of investment in skilling the architect, both design and manufacturing. So rejecting this condition, we're interested in reappropriation of the means of production. We see two main advantages. On the one hand, it provides an alternative to standardized products, and most importantly, it empowers creativity while making use of locally sourced materials and their shortcut of transnational supply chain with all its associated labor and environmental issues. So one of the consequences that instead of producing plans and sections, elevations in the Albertian way, we now desktop manufacture building parts, formwork, landscape guides directly in our office. So with the students and with LASA, we are interested in speculating on elaborate but affordable fabrication strategies that are specific to each project. We start each project by working at the elemental scale. This is an opportunity for us to ground the projects within historical precedents and to also learn the state of the art, whether it's grid shells, or tensile structures. We develop what we call a tectonic. It's usually in the beginning of the year, which is spatial as well as structural assembly through the blending of architectural elements, wall and floor, column and ceiling. And these form the premise of a vocabulary for the project that is then deployed typically in a more public building or a landscape project. Those tectonics can take the form of a fabric formwork. So in this case, Naida's projects and her portfolio is a knitted, printed fabric formwork element. So that's what she presented at the tables. And when you fill it with concrete, you get a space similar to the one on the side. So I would say the AA offers the opportunity to experiment and to give a more speculative side to what could be achievable in practice, although I think a lot can be done in practice as well. Here's Malek's experiments with ice formwork, Roning's experiments with the structural properties of inflated steel. So all the students have to produce prototypes at a small scale to validate speculations at a larger scale. And between 2012 and 2015, with DIP 17, we were working on the transformation of space for knowledge exchange, looking at changes in occupancy in the workplace and learning spaces. And we had the chance to work on a small Montessori nursery with LASA. We were originally asked to do some furniture, like psychomotricity furniture. And what we said is if instead of having a generic building with physically engaging furniture, what if we designed a library that could hold the building together? And if we could insert all the pedagogical elements within that library. So you have collapsing tables, you have drawing boards, as you can see on the right, little ladders for children to learn how to stand up, and leaning drawing boards. And the idea is that we designed a wall system that could be assembled in 3 minutes. That was one of the constraints when we modeled it. And And that integrates also the design brief and the pedagogical direction of the project. We pre-assembled 24 modules in 4 days, and then after 2 days on site, the building was closed. And as you can see here, we deployed the walls with the different, it's a combinatory sequence of the different types of functions that were, that emerge out of the discussions with the educators. Another important consideration for the unit is the role of the body. We have found a new relevance in the work of Claude Parent and the function of the oblique. So I guess that might be an overlap with the previous presentation. Claude Parent argues that by destabilizing the body through the use of the oblique plane, the body is confronted with the dialectic between the effort to climb up and a potential to let go. The body therefore cannot relieve itself from its environment, but is rather fully engaged with the real. And in our view, the more we upload aspects of our lives online, the more architecture has to be thought as an anchoring point in the real. Another important interest is the role of form for its capacity to organize perception while providing a framework for social life at the larger scale. A couple of years ago, we stopped producing renders in search of greater corporality in the production and communication of architecture. So we worked with photographer Naro to basically film and photograph our models. We later started to composite 3D and drawing over these films by mixing both physical and digital media. Transfer of technologies is also a very important notion for us, as it's an enabler it's a means to realizing our creative adventures. Although the role of technology has been the subject of debate, intense debate and polarization between those that reject it and those who fetishize it. So one of the unit's ambition is to unravel the cultural, social, and political ubiquity of technology and to highlight its impact in all aspects of architectural design, production, but also occupancy. So we investigate both the positive and perverse aspects of technology in architecture at both a social, ethical, environmental level, focusing more specifically on processes of concretization, democratic accessibility, collaborative agency, and transformation. So students are encouraged to visit manufacturers within or outside the construction industry, car manufacturing, boat building, and others, and shipbuildings as a way to produce complex form. And here you can see an example. This is, I had the chance to work for Future Systems, who built the media center using a shipyard. And that was not buildable by the construction industry at the time. Now with LASA, we are more interested in the democratization of construction, of the construction of complex form, and the potential use on normal commissions, or at least with normal budgets. So another experiment was the development of the key house, which is now complete in Greece. The site is located next to a busy road, and an important part of the brief was to provide the house with visual and acoustic intimacy from that road. So the massing splits the site into 4 spaces and protects the east courtyards from the road. The house is composed of a continuous surface, a continuous rippling wall that captures a series of walled gardens within the house. And the wall surface is undulating to be animated throughout the day by the course of the sun. So it's an OP art, let's say, undulation. We shipped a skeleton to give the outline of of the house to site. It was assembled in 4 hours. And for this project, we used transfer of technologies, but with a company that produces fish crates in Greece. So very inexpensive. It's a technology. They had a hot wire cutter. So we decided to produce the formwork for the undulating walls out of polystyrene. That polystyrene was then placed precisely on the MDF guides that I showed you earlier. And then we cast the concrete against it, and we had this variable undulation. Half the house is buried. As you can see, the facade on the edges is only 1 meter high, and the rest is terraced. And all the formwork was then recut and used within the walls as insulation. So it was all recycled as the insulation of the building. So Dora and I started LASA at the beginning of the financial crisis in 2009, while starting our teaching at the AA in Sweden. And we were interested in the democratization of digital design and manufacturing techniques and their potential deployment on commissions with normal budgets. So that is 300,000 euros, or $1,500 a square meter, or something like that. So an important case study for us was the Villa Ypsilon. It's a summer house. And most summer houses in this part of the world are oriented. They have a front and a back, and they are obsessed with a sea view. But our interest was to activate the whole periphery of the house, which is why we produced. The house is organized around 3 courtyards, like 3 hemispheres, where occupancy gravitates throughout the day. Each vault is framing a specific view. So not only the beautiful island and the landscape, but also the mountain with the cypress and the olive groves. And with the form of the shell, we were interested in designing occupancy. The west courtyard is in the shade in the morning for breakfast, and the shade shifts to east for lunch and to south for the evening. So the life of the house gravitates throughout the day around the house throughout the course of the sun. So form we designed form for occupancy, to design occupancy ultimately. And the form of the shell provides environmental resilience. So instead of using mechanical systems that are soon to be obsolete, in the house we used the form of the building and the watering of the plants on the roof to give it environmental resilience. One of the biggest problems was how to make it in such a remote area, and we didn't want to work with highly skilled contractors from Athens. So we said we are going to work with the locals in the village, and so we prototyped. We designed a formwork system that we laser cut at the AA to establish the method, and then we bought a CNC machine and started doing one-to-one prototypes in our office, and we did some load tests and things like that. Another interesting problem was the casting of the shell, the double curved part, as double curvature gives echo. So we produced and installed this whole formwork that's composed of 5,000 parts in 4 days. It was designed to be without any screws or any instruction manual. So the logistics and the speed at which we would execute it was really an important consideration throughout the modeling of it. And that is something that allowed us to reduce the construction budget by 5. So a house that would have typically cost €1.5 million, we were able to build for 300,000. So the Villa Ypsilon is part of a series of case studies. I would say we're in our 5th now, so I think we can call that a practice. But that is exactly what the students are encouraged to do. They develop their constructive systems. They test their viability with the greatest level of pragmatism, so that any kind of design speculation that comes throughout the course of the year is not something that's left on paper, but that becomes the premise of a practice once they graduate, and yeah, something that can be foundational and a great resource as a way to operate in the real world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Theo. Thanks very much for the presentations. I guess we can just do a physical clap, no? Yes. So I think, thank you both, Leire and Theo. I think we'll open up the discussions between the three of us, and I will then maybe towards the end, I might try to weave some of the Q&A on the chat functions into the discussions. But I think both of you has presented two very interesting, both coming in a sense embedded within the AA, but also taking design research into practice and then folding it back onto academia again. I think that double the dialogue is really interesting between both your practice and in your academia work. I guess what I'm also interested in is how, Theo, you talk about this idea of validations of scale, and I think Leire also did very similar things with the ceramics, you know, in GSD. I think you were doing that at. And I thought this process of validations, in a sense, makes some of the research, I guess, valuables and apparent and real, in the sense that it's no longer, it's only radical because you can build it, right? Rather than it's radical because it's you know, it's simply being drawn. And I think what Theo, you were talking about earlier, that you stop producing renders in teaching and only photograph the models, which I think is a really super interesting idea.
There's way more in producing a large piece than just. I mean, it's also a pedagogical strategy.
I'm interested in that strategy. Maybe you can expand a bit more, and maybe later I can also talk a little bit more about that. Yeah.
But
no, you go first.
No, I just think that with the opulence of or this continuous flow of images in Instagram, first of all, students are extremely disoriented on what is genuine, what has integrity, or what is just a brainless copy. And so there is a great, I think, suspicion about image, or at least we need to be increasingly critical about image. And so we thought, and you know, a lot of people are copying things without knowing what their precedents are and things like that. And so we said, okay, let's try to produce things to understand what they're made of, to understand their experiential qualities, and then let's develop a new kind of image that is that's not frictionless. That takes a lot of effort, I would say. I mean, that's one of the ideas of the Instagram flow, is that things are easy to make and they're weightless, and there's no you know, and the funny thing is the difference in justification of images that are likewise, like the 1 point perspective. We've seen the Magritte turning his back in every, which is turning up in every collage. I mean, I don't know if that's the case in Melbourne, but certainly in the continent and at the GSD, it's over the last 5 years, it's been really a soup of generic. So for us, it was more about the production of a spatial character and the praise of effort in an otherwise, in a world that is interested in the frictionless and the easy. I think students are less eager today to learn, at least in Europe, less eager today to learn complex programs and all that. So having to go through the pain is also a preview of what's coming. Like when you design a building, how many years does it take? How much patience? How much prototyping? I mean, you need to be patient as an architect. If you want to produce quick images, do something else.
No, I completely agree. We suffered from the same sort of pandemic here, I think, in terms of image overdose, you know, being paralyzed by the amount of Instagram images.
Okay, so just not to repeat a lot of the things that have mentioned by Theo, when you ask about validation, you are referring to the validation of the research that's undertaken?
Yeah.
Okay, because basically one of the aspects that I would like to point, you mentioned the ceramics, so let's take that as a kind of, you know, an area where I have been operating with the students and then in my own creative practice. There are various ways that you can enter, obviously, the research. But when we look into the ceramics, I will say that we started the pedagogy of the course by having getting acquainted with the material. Ceramic is such a kind of material that is so alive. Unless you touch it, you mix it, you get your hands dirty, you really don't understand the mixture and the consistency and all those sort of things that are heavily intuitive. You develop a sensibility towards it. So in that sense, in a way, we didn't necessarily depart from having extremely clear research output goals, but rather it was a bit of a playground, you know, where we were just having fun, looking for things, looking for unexpectancies, looking for opportunities, things that we could take further. And there was a moment in which there was a very close kind of, if you wish, kind of analysis of what was being produced with an eye towards what was going to be the question of the research that we were going to embark on, basically, but not a priori having an idea about what the output is going to be.
Yep.
There were other research lines within that course that perhaps had more, initial desires that were targeted towards perhaps hacking certain production lines within industry through the development of new tools that will be able to kind of shape the ceramic in certain ways. So for example, when you look at the production lines of bricks, and we had the students developing the equipment, the machinery that will be able to hack into that production line and produce, for example, double curve bricks or certain cuts into the bricks. And some of those explorations then in turn became the beginnings of more kind of larger research projects that were taken into one of the hubs that I collaborated with, and it became a much more extended kind of research. But there were other cases in which, as I said, it was very much starting from a pedagogy of being a kindergarten, basically a playground where you're trying to, you know, have fun and try to keep an eye towards unexpectancies that can turn into something. And then once that is identified, yes, there was a very rigorous process of really systematizing the process of production, looking into if sometimes perhaps they were some of these potentials were more linked to performative aspects. There was a very, very, as I say, rigorous kind of research into it and calibrating that and turning it into a really construction product that could be taken to industry, basically. But yeah, just two kind of angles to dive into the validation of the research.
No, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And
aspect of, I totally agree with Leire. Another aspect of this question has to do with risk taking, and so I think in the case of the work produced in school, it's discovering, validating, self-assessment, like assessing and discovering the unexpected, but also once validation is there, it really enhances speculation. But that in practice causes problems of liability, as you may know, Paul. So the whole prototyping has another role in practice, which is covering your liability, but also making sure that your project can be daring, but it has to be sound and so I think it's the pedagogical message to students is also that if you take the right steps after the discovery, you could be daring, and you don't need to, your creativity doesn't need to be tamed down by this constant intimidation of budget, liability, and things like that if you prototype things.
I think that's really a good point. I'd like to move us from the exploratory of the educations now towards practice. I think you're kind of learning to it. There's a question, and I'm trying to tie these questions on the Q&A back into here. So I may be paraphrasing your questions here. So within this sort of accreditations kind of environment that we operate in educations with environments and ESD as kind of important factors, climate crisis coming up or already happening, basically. And I think Leire's work very much delve into this area, sort of the tying real issues within the research, but also not just on paper, but also on material science. And I think, Theo, you already talk about that. You already started to put some of this into practice in a way. I get the questions on the Q&A is really about how do you negotiate this sort of difficult criteria around making architecture, which are inherently difficult in the sense that it makes architecture difficult because it doesn't produce that sort of frictionless, as you call it, artifacts. And yet, within academia, we always ask for a much more sinuous, like say, coherent form of design ideas as kind of thinking. How do we, in terms of the dialogue between the two, certainly in translating into practice, what's your thought on that?
Well, maybe I jump on by perhaps preempting one side of things. Perhaps in aiming to producing the perfect employee, sometimes students forget that they are in a forum, that they are in a very privileged position to also explore more freely, even if they have in mind all these issues that we are talking, that later they are going to face, liability, reality checks of sorts. But they are in a position where they really probably is one of the few times in their lives that they are going to have absolute freedom to explore. And I'm just going to give an example. When we first, I was part of the landscape urbanism program in the early phase, not the very first phase with Theo, but the early phase in which we were looking at certain aspects of resiliency and all these things. And initially, perhaps quite a lot of the strategies, ideas that we were putting forward, they might have been seen as megalomaniac or sometimes too technocratic, sometimes judged through different lenses. But give it time, and a lot of those things that we were exploring quite freely earlier on, but with our mind already put into the realities of practice, yet through a much more speculative lens. A few years down the line, they have become completely established practices. And you look into a lot of the landscape firms, big landscape firms, and a lot of that, the repertoire that was developed within the program has become now everyday practice. So in other words, I do think that through our teaching, we can certainly influence practice. Not to say that practice doesn't influence our pedagogical strategies, etc., but there is a huge value within the work of what we are doing here in the university, teaching, research, etc., that can really influence practice out there. So I think sometimes we are forgetting that, and we are trying to produce, as I say, the perfect employee that follows best practices as they are. And in that, we are losing the tremendous opportunity to kind of shake the system, revisit the system, look into, now you talk about the climate change, look into problems that we are facing, but with a fresh outlook into them, basically. Yeah. So yeah, Theo, I leave it to you now.
Yes, so in many ways, the academic work is also an anticipation of something to be more generalized in a very near future. Although it hasn't always been the case. I mean, I think about there was a time also, there have been periods where practice has been, let's say, more daring, more exploratory than things. But going back to the environmental question, there is a huge engagement. I think that was what you're hinting at earlier. There's a huge engagement at the AA at the moment in finding new ways of producing architecture with while diminishing the impact on the environment, and that has to go with the questioning of how materials are produced, where they come from, what's their lifespan, things like that. And so this year's research, for example, we embarked on a new research on production fields. So students went and visited quarries and things like that, and just going at the source, understanding the history, but also the socioeconomical context that these productions, where the production takes place, and how we can intervene before, let's say, between the raw material and the construction. So ways of putting raw material into form, like you're also quite interested in, like gun earth or other methods are being explored right now.
I think that we still got 10 more minutes. I think there's I got one more last question. It's come from one of the Q&A. I'm just going to twist it around a little bit. I'm sorry, Q&A functions, audience, because I just take all your questions and turn in my own. This is about design research and teaching and the formulation of agendas or processes or design processes. And I think both of you has outlined the relationship between the two. I mean, certainly from Leire, your journeys through from the AA to GSD, Cornell, etc., and then to here. And Theo, through your vast experience working with future systems, for example, formulating a very specific agenda. And I'm wondering how far, maybe perhaps both of you can talk a little bit about how design research within your own teaching also started to help you to establish your design processes or evaluate your own design processes or change your design processes to a certain degree. I'm using processes, assuming that you have multiple. Theo, do you want to go first?
I have to say that, as I mentioned before, I think the teaching at the A, a unit at the A is extremely formative, and it's where you develop your agenda, and where your agenda is under critical scrutiny, right? And so I think the greatest contribution at the AA, I mean, in terms of the greatest contribution or let's say the biggest learning of having a unit at the AA was the production of a theoretical framework, understanding practice within theory, and so obviously there's a speculative side, but because the emphasis in our current period is not on extreme complexity, but let's say measured complexity. The design research 10 years ago was about complex algorithm, mastering complexity or working with a level of intricacy that now we have to be critical of, right? And we have to assess what of that kind of repertoire is interesting to explore and has social resonance, and what is just futile, or it, will fall out of fashion because it was just about muscle flexing with software, right? So that kind of reassessment of the digital, or at least the last decades, between 2000 and 2010, like where a huge amount of experimentation was done, but without theorization, and the assessment of that period, and the kind of more deliberate harnessing of that into new practice with a different set of problems, environmental, social, etc., or priorities, not problems, but priorities. I think that was the most interesting thing for me.
Interesting.
And for this as well.
So maybe in this, I'm going to be quite brief. The thing is that everything I do has design research in mind, basically, probably because of also the fact that, again, it's very close to my training, that research was always there in the discussions, at the AA. I remember always the question of what's your thesis, what is the research about?
Yeah.
And that has kind of a stick to me all along. And probably because my practice is very small, I have the privilege that whenever we engage on real projects, they are also research projects. So they become the venue by which we can test some of the things that we are researching into, etc. So there is always, it's always research in our case. And I know I'm mentioning it there, I'm throwing it there very bluntly, but I do believe that what we do in the studios, what we do in our practice as understood traditionally, and what we do in our, what we do in our research as understood traditionally, and what we do in our practice is all related to our research.
Yeah. In the sense, they're always integrated and parallel, and they're always seen as
and
holistic.
informing each other, and always you are always trying to find avenues by which, oh, this can turn into this part of the research here or there, or it's opening up also research lines. So
I'm going to leave the last 5-10 minutes and see if there's any kind of question from the audience. Oh, Theo, sorry, you go.
Thing to Leire, because I think there was this assumption that design research is computational design, and let's say my experience of the late 2000s is that there, with Grasshopper in particular, there's the emergence of some kind of digital generic, where you just download an algorithm and students would just run that, and without true novelty. And so I think and also the justification of that research was through the process, and sometimes the outcomes were not that instrumental, or and so that's what I was saying. I became quite critical at some point. I mean, I think the whole school somehow.
Perhaps that's something that maybe I step out from being part of that group. I've never, I see what you mean, and I see where you are coming from, but none of my, in a way, design research agendas have ever come from, again, software exploration per se, as much as I am, very kind of equipped and use it, etc. But they tend to come from perhaps more either urgent or matters of concern that I find more interesting. And perhaps that interdisciplinarity that I was presenting today perhaps has enabled me to kind of move a little bit, to step out a bit from that trend of software-oriented, whatever, design research. So I think that's
the more formal, the more aesthetically driven, oriented kind of form of research.
Obviously, there is highly formal research as well going on in my work. It's obvious, but it's not focusing on purely the autonomy of form. It's trying to kind of bridge and borrow from other disciplines and trying to integrate these things to kind of perhaps address, again, larger challenges that we are facing. So, but that doesn't exclude the fact that form is a matter that I use every day.
Right.
Software is a tool I use every day, but the larger design research agenda is not coming from.
I'm more concern-driven as opposed to formal-driven. Theo, I know you got lots to say about aesthetics.
About the visiting school, and I think I'm in my 6th or 7th, is that when we arrive in Ditella, for example, or Melbourne, not Melbourne, but in some other let's say non-brother institutions, non-sister institutions, there's an expectation that we should teach the design research that was taught at the AA between 2005 and 2009, and there's it's always a bit anachronic and interesting to challenge these perceptions about what design research is at the AA and things like that. But I wasn't commenting on your work. I was commenting on the assumption of what design research is in London. Yeah. things have changed a lot, and I think that the repertoire of practices is a lot more diverse. Yeah.
No, thank you. I'm going to have to close this session because we are literally 1 minute away from closing. Thank you, Theo. Thanks very much. And Leire, thanks for the
Theo.
very engaging conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See
See you, Theo.
So-
Theo
Fine.
or Leire, if you want to join us on the spatial chat and everyone online, we're going to take a 5 minutes break. We'll change over to the next sessions. If you'd like to join us on the spatial chat, there should be a spatial chat link coming up on your chat functions, I imagine, soon. So we'll take a 5 minutes break. And the next session will be chaired by Donald Bakes. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see you, Theo.